Well, good evening. It's been a little while since we've had a chance to be together, and I do apologize for that. I've had a couple of work and scheduling conflicts get in the way, but as far as I can tell, I'll be here for much of the foreseeable future for several weeks to come. So we'll pick up where we are this week in Matthew chapter 25. And the title given by the lesson authors is The Dividing Prophet, in keeping with the theme of this first unit, but a tentative title and kind of bringing this together a little bit more cohesively, I think, might be Virgins, Talents, and Sheep. Now, up front, teaching this particular passage might be difficult for many of us, partly because it will have to be informed by whatever your choice of eschatology might be, as goes various different camps of preterism, historicism, idealism, futurism, and then, of course, various millennial views and so forth, because naturally that's going to drive how one is going to either parse up sections of Matthew chapter 24, the main discourse within the Olivet discourse, which of course is predicated upon chapter 23 and feeds into chapter 25, where we are today. With that being said, of course, if you convey the material between Matthew and Luke, and much of that is shared, but albeit by Luke, is divided up into different places. I think one thing we need to understand is neither gospel writer claims to be more historically accurate than the other. Neither one of them purports the idea that what they have preserved is a faithful rendering of exactly what Jesus said when Jesus said it. I want you to be careful in listening to what I just said. I'm not detracting away from what the gospel writers have said, but if you've heard me teach before, you understand that I have presented numerous times before the idea that the content of each of the Gospels is more or less modular in design, and these ancient writers had no qualms about moving those pieces around with no care or concern really for the historical accuracy of where that particular thing is being placed chronologically in their story, because it feeds their agenda and their overall subset of themes and, of course, their major themes. So that being said, Luke easily divides up some of the things that Jesus has said in Matthew chapters 23 through 25 and spread that out through different places within his gospel, which leaves us with the question of when did Jesus actually say these things? And that's not important for us to try to reconcile. What is important for us to reconcile is that while what Matthew is saying here is not supposed to be seen as normative and the interpretive key for how we will see it in the rest of the Gospels if this material is shared, instead, how does this feed into Matthew's overarching theme that unites his gospel? So that's part of what we've been discussing now for the last couple of quarters as we've dived into the New Testament. And so, of course, that's a hefty set of lessons you'll have to go back and reference as goes those major themes. Don't want to burn up a whole lot of time tonight really talking about that, but I would mention one with respect to something that I think needs to be repeated probably as often as we can, and that is Matthew is wanting us to appreciate Jesus in the light of Moses' representation as a prophet. And of course, there's some other roles that he kind of fills in the Old Testament too, but largely as prophet, because of the fact that he orchestrates the blocks of Jesus' teaching into 5 major discourses. In Matthew 24, which we discussed last week, I say we as in the fact of the church and Sunday school. I wasn't here to really guide anybody through that. But that being said, this is the final discourse. And so with that, it's Jesus' last instruction to these people, this new Israel that he's carved out from the disciples he's brought closer to himself out of the larger Talmudim or group of disciples that follow him, and branded them as his emissaries. These will be the ones that carry this kingdom message beyond Jesus' tenure as an earthly prophet to take on his role as a cosmic king. So that being said, if we look at the idea of this last discourse being somewhat analogous to the final discourse that Moses gives to the people of Israel, it takes on the form of the scroll we call Deuteronomy. Those are instructions for taking the land, going in and setting up the kingdom that God, of course, promised to Abraham, that is now going to be geographically centered in the land of Canaan, that they will go in and take over. And so Jesus is about to tell them what is coming in the days ahead, and that is the arrival of this kingdom, and of course, what will happen after this kingdom has actually come crashing into human history with the ascension of Jesus to the right hand of the Father, and then the mandate given to these disciples that they have to step up and actually start to execute, or else this whole movement's going to completely fall apart, which leads us into the beginning of the book of Acts. So we'll have to really carefully dissect Matthew chapters 23 through 25 to listen to what Jesus is saying. Ask difficult questions that may make us uncomfortable with respect to whatever our eschatological position might be, and hold that in abeyance as goes, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe what I've presumed up to this point actually needs to be checked. And always do that anytime we're going through this particular passage of Scripture, partly because Matthew comes to us, canonically speaking, first. And of course, there's a lot more material that's really centered around this sort of thing from start to finish. Matthew is highly, deeply eschatological. That being said, as we move through the rest of the Gospels, we shouldn't just make presumptions in Matthew and then let that force us to interpret everything else we see held in Matthew but repeated in other Gospels as having to be interpreted that way. Sometimes those Gospels make us go back and actually look at our presumptions on Matthew. I digress. Let's get into this up here with respect to this first block, this first parable that comes to us at the beginning of Matthew 25, and that being the parable of the 5 wise, 5 foolish virgins who were called out to the wedding party, but of course have to wait a little while. And then the bridegroom unexpectedly appears. Of course, they are anticipating his arrival, but unexpectedly comes at a time they obviously did not know. And so with that, the 5 wise are prepared, the 5 foolish are not, and we understand what the fallout is. But this is the part of the problem. We have a tendency to laserly focus, I should say microscopically, with laser-like precision, focus in on this portion of Matthew's gospel and easily divorce it in our minds from everything else that comes before it. We need to pay attention to Matthew's literary devices he's embedded in the gospel. In fact, Jesus has a tendency here to distinguish between the wise and the foolish, and he's done this already. And this actually bookends the entire gospel. So this is a part of Matthew's intentional literary design in arraying Jesus' teachings for us. In the first big block, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus finishes that whole sermon with this dichotomy of those who are wise and those who are foolish. Those who hear his words, and if they do them, they are like the house that's built upon the rock. Those who listen but do not do are those who build their house upon the lack of foundation, the sand. And of course, we understand the difference between the two as goes what the outcomes will be. The same is said here with respect to what Jesus is saying as goes those who have heard his words in Matthew 23 and 4 and the coming of the destruction of Jerusalem, and with that, the arrival of the cosmic kingdom that's going to completely change the world and fulfill the mandate that God gave Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. The nations are going to be brought front and center to have to interact with this, not only on the part of the spectrum as goes human governance and authorities and how will kingdoms accord the subjects of Jesus' kingdom, and will they entreat them well or will they instead entreat them spitefully? And Jesus gets into that with respect to the sheep and goat judgment we'll talk about momentarily. But nonetheless, Jesus is really seemingly focusing on here those who have followed him up until this point and those who have heard his words and whether or not they will respond wisely or foolishly. Because according to Matthew 24 and how one may take that chapter, Jesus is going to be coming. Now, of course, some may take that as Jesus is going to be coming in the future, and of course he is. We should all agree on that. But whether or not we're talking about all of Matthew 24 being held in anticipation for a future time or parts of Matthew 24, and we don't have time to discuss that now. That's part of what we're all learning together with the John Piper book and part of what has been discussed in a previous sermon that Bart preached, and of course lessons we have to look forward to in the future with breaking down different viewpoints on the millennium. My personal approach is looking at a preteristic point of view of Matthew 24 and seeing that the majority of that chapter, if not almost every bit of it, I think better than 90% of it, was fulfilled in AD 70. That being said, if that is my interpretive key bleeding over into Matthew chapter 25, Jesus is talking about his servants in the perspective of the 5 wise and 5 foolish. He's not talking about the idea of these 10 virgins actually being a cross-section of all of humanity, and we're talking about some who are waiting for his arrival and others who have heard about the news of it, but of course have not properly prepared. Then when the time comes for the bridegroom to arrive, they are shut out for the millennial kingdom that's going to arrive once Jesus comes. Instead, this is speaking perhaps more so to the idea of what's going to happen immediately after Jesus leaves the earthly scene and goes to take up his place ruling at the right hand of God. And so we're looking now at the historical fallout of what Jesus has said, as goes arraying the kingdom in the fashion of this parable. But let me digress for a second, because without having to get caught up in a whole eschatological approach and which one you want to use, instead I would draw all of us to this second black box here, which no matter what our approach might be, I think we can all take this away in commonality. The response by the hearers is what's the key to this particular parable. And I think this would fit for any particular eschatological approach. Going back to what Jesus says to round out the Sermon on the Mount discourse, if he's speaking like Moses in Deuteronomy, then we have to understand when he's talking about the house that one builds, rather than seeing it from a purely Western perspective, which has a large predominant tendency to want to view much of the Bible's discourses, whether we're talking about Jesus' words or anyone else, from a very individualistic standpoint. And that's not primarily, if at all, what Jesus is actually saying in connection with what he is presenting here as one's house. It's easy to individualize this, but Jesus, being a Semite in the ancient Near East, part of the Oriental culture that is entirely honor shame and is driving the success of the community far away above and separate from that of the individual, which seems to fade into the background and almost become completely insignificant. The idea here is that the house has to take on a corporate perspective, not an individual perspective. If that's the case, the house that he's speaking of then is the house of Israel, because he is the king that Matthew has presented to them, descended from Abraham through David. He is the prophet likened to Moses, who is leading them into, to finish the final phases of this Exodus, the new kingdom that God promised per Isaiah's words. And again, Matthew is the one who brings forth the Isaiah 7:14 promise of the one who would come forth from the virgin, right? And of course, that birth narrative focuses on the actual geographic birthplace of the king. All that to simply say, this is the rise and fall of Israel's house. This is her destiny promised by the prophets before and after the exile, and now that time has arrived. And they will either find their place in the house if they listen and do, or outside the house if they listen and fail to do. So Matthew then is connecting that here to what these virgins are doing in this particular portion of Matthew's gospel. Either they hear and they will do. They will wait with anticipation on the arrival of their master that's going to come at a time they do not know. But in the interlude, they are going to work faithfully to discipline themselves to execute the mission. That's just it. It's not just simply waiting, it's doing. It's having proper preparation and seen by carrying enough oil to make sure that their torches are lit and properly fed until the time the master comes, or the bridegroom in this case. So, ultimately, this boils down to it being a parable centered around wisdom and whether or not Jesus' servants are going to actually carry out the kingdom mandate, or are they going to become slothful in the interlude, in the way I particularly look at it, from the time that Jesus leaves until the destruction of Jerusalem. And it's not just the destruction of Jerusalem. May I caveat this preterist approach with a little bit of a different flavor that most aren't usually aware of. Because when you read the words of Tacitus and Josephus and many other first century ancient historians, we come to understand the destruction of Jerusalem was not at a moment of a high point in Rome's legacy. In fact, right up until that particular moment when Vespasian was leading the charge, Vespasian had to leave the entire affair over to his son Titus to go back to Rome and claim emperorship for himself, because he was the one sole figure that seemingly could unite all of Rome. From the time that Nero committed suicide up until the time Vespasian took the throne, there were at least 3, some historians argue 4 emperors that reigned for a period of months, and Rome was being torn apart through internal strife on the brink of civil war. Tacitus posits it as basically the destruction of the world, because if Rome falls, in his perspective, Rome being the light of the world, then there is no dawn for humanity that lay beyond that. And so God was bringing judgment not just upon Jerusalem, but even upon the known world that's being ran and controlled by Rome, which for the last few years has been swallowing up Christians through martyrdom, as has bloodthirsty Jerusalem itself. So that being said, we need to also understand that how Jesus is seemingly positing the idea, how will his disciples act in the face of tyranny, martyrdom, oppression, even offering up their lives in defense of the faith until he, quote, comes, end quote, in judgment, leading the charge, using the mercenary armies of Rome and other nations to destroy bloodthirsty Jerusalem and to shake up Rome in such a way that after it's all said and done, the sieve settles down, Vespasian rules as emperor, it becomes a peaceful time for Christians to spread the gospel and to live peacefully. There's some periods of judgment there too, or I should say martyrdom in the hands of other emperors. But that being said, it becomes a time when peace begins to flourish for Christianity and the message began to prosper. So that's one way of seeing this. Now we move on to the next parable. The next parable is that in which we have the master calling forth his servants and entrusting possessions to them. This is where we get that rendition of Matthew's use of this parable, of the servant who gets 5 talents, the servant who gets 2, and the servant who gets 1. And then when the master arrives, he does not settle himself in to then take account whenever he finds the time to do so or the desire to do so. He immediately takes account of his servants and what they've been doing with the talents he entrusted to them. Now here's the thing. We need to realize this actually connects back to the end of Matthew 24, and we know that to be the case because of the linkage of the two parables through the use of the words servant and the way those servants are portrayed. Because we go back to Matthew 24, Jesus asked the question, who then is a faithful and wise servant whom his master has put in charge of his household to give them both food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom the master finds doing his job when he comes. And truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that wicked servant, and so that phrase used by Matthew to sum up this one servant who chooses not to be diligent as his master has commanded him to be and hope to find him being upon his arrival, is the exact same phrase that Matthew uses from the words of the master who arrives back to his house, settles accounts, sees that the one who was entrusted 5 and 2 have flourished, but the one who was given 1 chose to bury it, make nothing of it, accuses the master and tries to lay the blame on him. And then the master gives the fate of what that servant's going to be by calling him a wicked servant. So if we end Matthew 24, understanding that seemingly Jesus is talking a lot about the destruction of Jerusalem, maybe exclusively about the destruction of Jerusalem, and the idea that the concept of the Jewish kingdom age, as goes what was purported by the Pharisees, and of course other sects that had some eschatological view in mind, the Zealots, the Essenes, and so forth, the arrival of Messiah, a Davidic kingdom that's going to conquer the world and enslave the nations, and of course start with Rome and the impostor priesthood. That has to be completely shaken loose. They have to let go of that, and they have to instead embrace the concept of kingdom that Jesus has been advertising for the last 3 years, and that these people who have followed him, even to Jerusalem now, have pledged their lives unto him as being his obedient kingdom subjects, are going to have to finally rid themselves of all the vestiges of that kingdom eschatology and instead embrace the biblical kingdom eschatology that Jesus has been opening their minds to. And that kingdom eschatology is not going to be one of conquering in a worldly sense. It's going to be conquering in a spiritual sense. Because from the outward perspective, Christians are going to be dying. In the spiritual sense, Christians are going to be flourishing, because in spite of the threats against the kingdom, more and more people are going to come and embrace this message by the thousands, tens of thousands even. And churches are going to be popping up all throughout the Jewish and the Roman world, despite the most vehement efforts by both an unlicensed, or I should say a licensed and unfettered Jerusalem that's got the full proxive power of Nero behind it to do whatever they want to Christians, and Nero giving open hunting license to everybody that wants to destroy them, especially in the vicinities of Rome. So that being said, the idea here then is, what are Jesus' servants going to do? That's the interpretive key. We go back to this black box. Did the slave in Matthew 24 eagerly work? We have to understand that. That's the use of the word servant, doulos, slave. Did they eagerly work in the master's absence and thereby maintain a high degree of faithfulness to the kingdom agenda that Jesus has given them? The idea the world has to change. They're not just simply holding on tightly, waiting for the king to arrive and the king to do all the dirty work. Instead, they are right there with him, sleeves rolled up, feet enmeshed in the mud, and they are doing the dirty work of seeing souls brought out of darkness, the dominion of darkness, and into the kingdom of light. That concept bleeds over to Matthew 25, where we have 3 servants, and the master has entrusted valuable possessions to all of them. The question then becomes, if this is really a parable that seemingly is speaking about the end of time, a time that is yet still future to us, how then do we parse out the idea of there being servants who are entrusted things from the master to do the master's bidding, And somehow in all of that scheme, we start to factor in unbelievers. Believers, or I should say people who have never partaken of the gifts of the Master, never known what it was like to be in the kingdom, never submitted themselves to the authority of the King. It seemingly would be a wrong approach to this. And if that's the case, that provides a big challenge to the idea of this being a final judgment of sorts. Instead, it seemingly might fit better with the picture presented to us in Matthew 24 of a coming imminent judgment that's going to arrive within a generation of Jesus departing the scene, but then coming back to destroy Jerusalem, shake up the world, and by virtue of that, He is going to gather His servants, and with that, He is going to find some worthy and some who are going to be unworthy. Because, of course, there will be people, and we see this littered throughout the epistles, the writing of the early church apostles, who tell us that there were challenges within churches abroad. There were people who pretended to be believers, people who had even perhaps partaken and tasted of some of these gifts, but in some measure of apostasy chose to walk away. Think of Paul's lambasting of Demas at the end of his letter to the churches in Colossae. So, in Matthew 24, did the slave eagerly work? Matthew 25, was the slave productive? Having a talent isn't enough. Now, that doesn't mean having a talent isn't enough to be in the kingdom. The master has made the slave a part of his household, so therefore the question and status of the slave is not held in abeyance here. The real question is okay, now that you've been given the talent, what will you do with it? And just possessing the talent is not enough to satisfy or appease the master. We have to be productive. The big question looming large is after Jesus leaves the scene and the kingdom is entrusted to the servants and all the resources that are made available to them, what will they do with them? Will they be wicked, slothful servants? Will they be those who lord their authority over others and choosing rather than to serve all, to be Lord over all, which Jesus warns against this kind of thing? Or instead, will they actually choose to be self-sacrificial, deny themselves, take up their cross, follow Him, love their neighbor as themselves, all these things? Those are the echoes from what Jesus has taught earlier in Matthew that leaches into this that we cannot forget. And that will lead us to the final one here, where I'm sure you would ask, okay, so maybe I can see some of the connections you've made in these previous parables here to stuff that may have happened in first century Israel. But the sheep and goats, that kind of seems really clear with respect to the idea of this being an end of time type of judgment. And I'm not really going to try to present this in such a way to make you abandon that position. Instead, I would just call some things into question here and challenge it, not for the sake of getting you to see a different eschatological point of view, but more so to see it in keeping with what Matthew has already taught in this gospel and the sources that Matthew's pulling from other parts of Scripture. I'm trying to zoom in on that. There we go. So Matthew 25:31, when the Son of Man comes in His glory and all the angels with Him, then He will sit on His glorious throne. Now, we have to understand this has already been defined for us as what this means. Jesus' use of these words, coming in His glory, sitting at the right hand of the Father, coming in the clouds of heaven, are recycled and regurgitated pieces of Daniel's vision. In fact, Matthew's the first one, canonically speaking, to use that as Jesus answers the charges levied against Him by Caiaphas. So we have to see that from beginning to end. We are not looking outside of what already has been given to us from Scripture. So Daniel 7, the vision of the one who appears like a son of man, riding on the clouds of heaven to ascend to the presence of the Ancient of Days to receive a kingdom, okay? So if it's receiving a kingdom, then we have to ask the question, if what Jesus is talking about, as goes this sheep and goat judgment, is yet still future to our own time, has He received the kingdom? And I don't think it's enough to say He's received the kingdom, but He has yet to receive the kingdom. As if to say the now and not yet concept seemingly answers all of this. Yes, the kingdom has arrived, it's come. It's not fully manifested itself as far as all of its final phases goes. That's true. But we have to ask the question of, has he received His kingdom? Because Jesus saying, when the Son of Man comes in His glory to sit on His glorious throne, when is the moment that He receives this glorious throne? According to Daniel, it comes with the destruction of the final kingdoms. And that happens in Rome's day. That's the vision of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2. This is a recapitulation of it in Daniel 7, using the 4 beasts instead. And if we need an interpretive key from the New Testament that really clears this up for us, we have to go to John's Gospel, which is the next arrow down. Because in John 12:32, this is what Jesus said. As for me, if I am lifted up is the same phrase utilized in Isaiah 6, speaking of the one seated on the throne of heaven, whose feet touch the footstool, the Ark of the Covenant, in the temple, where Isaiah is in this vision to see this as heaven and earth collide together. It's an enthronement language, and Jesus is speaking about the time of his enthronement, and that is the moment of his crucifixion, when John says very clearly, the moment he is glorified. When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. He said this to indicate what death he was about to die. The crowd replied, we've heard that from the law that the Messiah will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man, a Daniel term, must be lifted up, which is enthroned, as goes Daniel 7. But that paradoxical enthronement where he dies and is shamed is the moment he is glorified and exalted simultaneously, vindicated by the fact the grave doesn't hold him, and he literally does ascend to the right hand of the Father to receive that kingdom then, not then. Meaning not then in the past, not then in the future. So if that's the case, man, that really makes us stop and rethink what Jesus is saying here, because we go down and we hear the very clear dichotomy Jesus presents. Two groups, sheep and goats, and he says, you came and visited me, you did so when I was hungry, when I was thirsty, when I was in prison, when I was cold and naked, when I was sick. When did we do this? When you did it to the least of these, my brethren. Clear question there. Who exactly are Jesus' brothers? There are different ways of parsing this up, but of course I think the immediate context almost begs the understanding it has to be seen as Jesus' own disciples. And of course outside of that, those who will be added to the count of disciples. Now with that, it does create a transcendent interpretation that even applies here and now. To make us, as we work through this, ask the question, how are we according other disciples? How do the nations at large accord Jesus' followers? Because this can have both a corporate and primarily, first and foremost, a corporate understanding and interpretation, but it also requires some measure of an individual interpretation and understanding. But I digress. We go to the black box. How will the nations steward the brothers of Jesus in their mission? And of course, that boils down to how this happens from AD 33-ish, or whenever Jesus ascended to heaven, up until AD 70, when Rome and Jerusalem are judged for their horrible mistreatment, not only of the rejection of Jesus as Messiah, but the destruction or the intended destruction of his people by annihilating as many Christians as they possibly could, hence his judgment. Then after that, there's a new world order created in light of that, in which, granted, the Roman Empire is going to continue, but within a few centuries, Christianity has conquered Rome. I mean, granted, it does give rise to Roman Catholicism and a fair measure of apostasy that will reign large for nearly 1,000 years. But that being said, some of the creeds that we still hold dear come from this particular time period in which, forged in fire and blood, we see Christians rising to the occasion and truly meeting the kingdom mandate that Jesus left them with. And of course, nations are going to continue to be judged, as goes how they treat the followers of Christ. So, a lot to take away here. Let me read these final two boxes here to make sure we cinch this up as goes the time framing of it all. In Matthew 26, Jesus said to Caiaphas, in the future you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, fulfilling Daniel 7, of course, the ascension of Jesus to the right hand of the Father. And then Stephen verifying this for us as he is taking his final gasps of air. He is about to give up the ghost, as one might say. And he looks into heaven and seeing the firmament above parted. And as he is gazing deeply into the throne room of heaven, he sees the one seated on the throne and the one who is at his right hand now standing. This is Jesus, enthroned, of course, and he rules with all authority in heaven and on earth. So it should solidify the question of when this king comes to take his place on his glorious throne. It would be inappropriate for us to look at Matthew 25 at this particular moment when this judgment is coming and say, okay, so at that moment, Jesus takes his position as king. Then, thousands of years later, this particular judgment is going to come. That seemingly is only coming to us because we still think this has to be seen as an end-time judgment. Instead, I would challenge you to look at it in its context and question whether or not that's actually the case. Not to adopt my point of view or that of anyone else, but just in keeping with what Matthew has been presenting to us over the totality of his gospel. All right. That's our time. Do we have any questions? Statements? I'm just waiting for a rotten egg or tomato to come flying at me and somebody to say heretic. But thankfully, that's not happening now. So Thanks.